February 26, 1901, New Jersey, in a corporate law office built for ink, not noise. The room has the clean fatigue of professional repetition, paper stacks, ribbon-tied bundles, carbon copies arranged so the order cannot be argued later. On a side table, a bottle of sealing wax and a stamp pad sit like tools for a trade that pretends it is not a trade. A clerk turns pages with a finger that has learned not to hesitate. The margins are wide. The type is dense. The language is not written to be read aloud. It is written to survive courtrooms and panics and deaths. Incorporated, authorized capital, common, preferred, directors, transfer agent. The words are quiet, but they carry weight. A fountain pen pauses at a signature line. The nib touches down. Ink spreads into paper fiber, and a new entity becomes real in the only way this country fully trusts. In writing, witnessed, filed, and time-stamped. No blast furnace is visible from here, no heat, no sparks, no men with soot in their eyebrows. And yet this is steel's modern birthplace, the moment when ore and coal and labor are converted into securities and voting rights and dividends, into a structure that can outlive the men who built it. Outside, ferries move across gray water, freight schedules continue, telegraph lines keep their steady work. The mills in Pennsylvania still roar as they did yesterday, but today the roar has been given a ledger. Somewhere between the clerk's pencil and the lawyer's seal, an inheritance is assigned. Not the inheritance of a single family name. The inheritance of an industry, America's steel, gathered into a form that can be owned, traded, and defended. And a man who did not inherit money in childhood is about to be described, in the language of finance, as if he did. Charles M. Schwab is not signing the papers in this room. His presence is elsewhere, in conversations, in promises, in the memory of a dinner speech that made bankers imagine an entire nation built from standardized beams and predictable costs. His name is already moving through offices that smell like ink instead of coke smoke. The question is not whether steel can be made in quantities the world has never seen. The question is who gets to decide what steel becomes. Chapter 1. The Time Clock. February 18, 1862, Williamsburg, Pennsylvania. A town measured in distances that can be walked. A place where the future arrives as rumor first. A new mill hiring, a railroad extending, a mine paying by the day. The money is not elegant. It is counted. It is carried. It is spent where it can be seen. Charles Michael Schwab is born into a country already practicing its real religion, production. The United States is not yet the giant it will become, but the mechanism is visible. Rail lines, workshops, furnaces, the administrative habit of turning material into invoices. When he is still young, the path toward steel is not a grand plan. It is a time clock, a shift, a job title that can be upgraded by competence and by the willingness to be present when other men go home. He does not enter the industry through inheritance. He enters the way most people enter industries that will later be called empires. At the bottom, near the noise, where the cost of error is immediate. In the 1880s, he is at the Edgar Thomson Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania, one of the places where modern steelmaking is not an idea, but a schedule. The plant is a geography of tasks. Furnaces, casting, rolling, rail spurs, storage yards. Everything is counted because everything is expensive. Ore must arrive. Coke must be ready. Rail cars must not idle too long. A delay is not a mood. It is a number. A young man who can keep numbers aligned, tonnage, hours, output, maintenance, becomes valuable. Not because he speaks well, because he makes the machine behave. Schwab moves upward through responsibility. General Superintendent at Homestead by 1887. General Superintendent at Edgar Thomson by 1890. These are titles that do not sound romantic, but they are the hinge points of industrial power. A superintendent controls the facts on the ground, what the mill can do, what it cannot, what it costs to push it harder, what it costs when it breaks. There is a turning point hidden inside this kind of work. The day a man becomes more useful to owners than the owner's own instincts. The day he can walk through a plant and see waste like a stain. By 1897, at 35, Schwab becomes president of Carnegie Steel. A salary that crosses into 7 figures is attached to him, not as a reward for personality, but as an admission by the system. This is an operator the system cannot afford to lose. What remains today is not the feeling of the furnaces. It is the geography. Braddock still holds the Edgar Thomson works, still close to the Monongahela, still tied to the logic that brought it there. Homestead is still a name in Pittsburgh's industrial memory, with a document trail that outlives the noise, company records, labor histories, and the physical remnants of an industrial corridor that once fed a nation's appetite for beams, rails, and plate. The question is not whether a man can climb in America. The question is what the climb requires him to become. Chapter 2, The Dinner Menu. December 12, 1900, Manhattan, the University Club. A private room, linen folded with precision, cutlery aligned like instruments. Men in formal clothing sitting under the calm confidence of a city that believes it can price anything. This is not a mill. It is the other half of the steel industry, the half that never sweats. The steel that will shape skylines is, tonight, being shaped into a story that financiers can understand. Schwab stands among people who do not measure production in tons. They measure it in stability, in control, in the ability to make a chaotic industry behave like a predictable machine. He speaks to them in their own language without abandoning his own. He is describing economies of scale as if they are a moral good. He is describing consolidation as if it is safety. The dinner itself is an inventory. Courses arrive on schedule. Plates disappear. Wine is poured. The room's logistics are meant to reassure. Everything is handled. Schwab's speech is not remembered because it is poetic. It is remembered because it is useful. It provides a map. Take the scattered steel companies, bind them together, standardize output, control prices, control raw materials, control transportation, and the nation's most violent industry can become, at least on paper, a disciplined source of return. It is a turning point because it gives J.P. Morgan a picture he can act on. Morgan's power is not in making steel. It is in making structures that can own steel. After the speech, the conversation narrows, not in public, in private. This is how modern American decisions often happen, not with applause, but with a quiet reduction of options until only one path remains. The obstacle is Andrew Carnegie, who owns not only mills and ore interests, but the idea that his company is the crown. Carnegie does not sell because he needs money. He sells if the terms satisfy his sense of magnitude. Negotiations begin with the same objects that always carry power in New York: letters, notes, drafts, terms reduced to numbers that can be initialed. The price that emerges, $480 million for Carnegie Steel, is not just a price. It is a declaration of scale, a number so large it forces the country to expand its imagination of what a corporation can be. And in the middle of this, Schwab becomes something new, a bridge between soot and capital, not a laborer, not a banker, a translator, the kind of man who can walk the distance from a furnace to a club dining room and make both places feel like parts of the same machine. What remains today is the city itself, the institutional corridors of Manhattan where these consolidations were conceived: clubs, bank buildings, law offices, not preserved as museums of steel, but as functioning monuments to the administrative habits that turned industry into finance. The question is not whether bankers can understand steel. The question is whether steel, once understood by bankers, can ever be returned to anything else. Chapter 3. The Stock Certificate, February-March 1901. New York and Pennsylvania, moving between offices and estates, between telegraph lines and private conversations. A deal of this size is not completed with one handshake. It is completed with coordinated paperwork, drafts that travel, messengers who know which door to use, lawyers who alter clauses with the calm of men altering landscapes. When the agreement is reached, the United States Steel Corporation is assembled as a holding company with an authorized capitalization around $1.4 billion, an amount so large it becomes a headline even for people who have never seen a furnace. This is the true inheritance in the title, not a bequest written by a father to a son, an inheritance engineered by consolidation, America's steel gathered into a single corporate body, able to purchase competitors, absorb suppliers, and defend itself with sheer size. Schwab becomes the first president. The role sounds like authority, and it is, but it is also confinement. A president of a giant corporation must be legible to bankers. He must be stable. He must not behave like a man who has lived too close to the noise. The company's steel is not a metaphor. It is rails, beams, plate, wire, pipe, materials that become bridges, skyscrapers, ships, and the quiet skeleton of modern life. Each product has a specification. Each specification becomes a contract. Each contract becomes revenue. Each revenue line becomes a justification for the structure that now owns the mills. But the structure has its own gravity. The larger it is, the more it demands internal peace, not peace in mills, peace in the boardroom. A turning point arrives quickly, the kind that can only happen in a system built on control. Schwab, the operator and persuader, is no longer simply managing production. He is managing expectations. He is managing personalities that cannot be fired. He is managing the contradiction between the speed of industry and the caution of finance. Within a few years, he is out. The reasons are not a single scandal that can be stamped and filed. They are the ordinary reasons that run large organizations: disagreements over direction, discomfort with style, the fear that a man who moves too quickly might pull the structure into risk. Schwab's next move is not retirement. It is repetition, taking what he knows and applying it elsewhere, shaping Bethlehem into a rival power, tying steel again to war orders and construction booms, proving that the industry's inheritance can be moved from one corporate body to another by will and by leverage. What physically remains today is the record of what consolidation built. The financial architecture, bank buildings and corporate archives. The industrial architecture, plants and sites that still mark rivers and rail lines. In Bethlehem, the blast furnaces stand as preserved silhouettes, a rusted skyline that has been repurposed into public space, entertainment, and memory. The steel is no longer poured there, but the shape of the place remains, refusing to disappear. The question is not whether a man can be made powerful by being placed at the top of $1 billion structure. The question is, what happens when the structure decides it no longer needs him? Chapter 4. The Telegram Form, May 1903, New York City, a telegraph office near the financial district. The counter is worn smooth where hands have rested while waiting. A clerk sits beneath a clock that is not decorative, it is operational. Time is part of the charge. Blank forms are stacked in a tray. The paper is thin, designed for speed. A man steps forward, gives an address, dictates a message that will be turned into dots and dashes and carried across wires strung through cities and fields. The clerk writes quickly, not looking up, as if words are just another commodity to be routed. This is how corporate authority travels when it cannot be carried in person, not by speeches, by short instructions that can fit into a pricing structure. Schwab knows this system intimately. He has used it to move steel schedules, to coordinate purchases, to settle questions in minutes that once took days. But now he is on the wrong side of the machinery he helped create. United States Steel is only 2 years old, and already it has developed the habits of an institution that wants to outlive individuals, committees, reports, a pace of decision designed to preserve capital rather than chase opportunity. The corporation is a ship with many officers and a limited tolerance for sudden turns. Schwab has never been a man built for committee rhythm. His authority was forged in mills where delay has a physical consequence. Molten metal cooling, orders missed, equipment damaged, men injured, contracts lost. That kind of reality teaches a different tempo. In board meetings, tempo becomes politics. A man who speaks with certainty can be interpreted as reckless. A man who demands action can be read as impatient, and impatience in finance is treated like a flaw of character. The turning point is not a single telegram. It is the accumulation of them, the tightening of communication into formal channels, the way authority becomes less about what you can do and more about what you are permitted to decide. By 1903, the break is complete. Schwab resigns as president of U.S. Steel. A title that was supposed to be the apex becomes a brief interlude. The corporation continues without him, which is the point of the corporate form. It is built so that no man is essential. For Schwab, resignation is not merely loss. It is a lesson in what modern power prefers: stability over brilliance, governance over momentum, predictability over personal drive. He does not retreat to a quiet life. He shifts terrain. The question is not whether a corporation can be larger than any individual. The question is whether an individual who understands steel can ever accept being smaller than the corporation. What remains today is the paper trail: U.S. Steel's early records, the press coverage, the corporate reports, the residue of a decision that reshaped the industry's leadership. The telegraph offices themselves are largely gone, absorbed into newer communications infrastructure, but their logic remains. Instructions reduced to compact forms, sent at speed, received by people trained to obey the written word. Schwab leaves behind a billion-dollar structure. He walks into the next phase carrying something more portable: his reputation as the man who can make steel not only produce, but persuade. Chapter 5, The Blast Furnace Ledger, June 1904, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The Lehigh Valley is not a place that tries to impress outsiders. It is a working landscape: rail spurs, brick factories, smoke that settles into the day like weather. The Bethlehem Steel Company exists here, but at this moment it is not yet the symbol it will become. It is a plant with potential, a set of furnaces and rolling mills that can either expand or be overtaken. Schwab arrives not as an employee, he arrives as a buyer. The acquisition is not romantic. It is a ledger problem: assets, liabilities, capital needed, markets, raw material supply, rail access, contracts. He studies what the plant can do, and more importantly, what it could do if rebuilt for modern scale. In steel, the difference between a plant that survives and a plant that dominates is often measured in investment that looks frightening on paper. New furnaces, new rolling mills, new cranes, new yards, new rail connections, power generation, housing for workers. The plant becomes a city of machines, and each machine requires money before it produces money. Schwab secures control of Bethlehem Steel and becomes its president. The title here fits him differently. This is not a committee-built giant. It is a company that can be shaped quickly by one will, if that will can attract capital. He expands capacity and shifts product emphasis toward heavy structural shapes and, increasingly, armor plate and gun forgings, steel that is not just for bridges and buildings, but for war. A turning point arrives with the contracts. Government orders have their own logic. They require compliance, specifications, deadlines, inspection regimes, and an administrative structure that can survive scrutiny. They also offer volume and payment backed by the state. Bethlehem begins to feed the U.S. Navy and foreign clients. The plant becomes not only an industrial site, but a strategic node. When a nation's defense depends on steel, the company that can deliver it becomes something like an institution. But the institution is still built out of labor schedules and raw material shipments. Ore moves by rail and by water. Coal and coke must be timed. A furnace cannot be turned on and off like a light. Once running, it demands continuous feeding. Maintenance becomes a formal discipline. Breakdowns become accounting entries. Schwab's style shows itself in physical expansion, new facilities, new equipment. The transformation is visible on maps and in payrolls. What remains today is the site itself. Bethlehem's blast furnaces, later preserved as monumental ruins, stand like the ribs of an industrial animal. The steel no longer flows there, but the structures remain, massive enough to force memory into the landscape. The corporate records and engineering drawings sit in archives, where the real scale of the operation can be measured in procurement lists and construction plans. The question is not whether Schwab lost the presidency of a giant corporation. The question is whether losing it freed him to build something more aligned with his nature. Chapter 6. The Mansion Budget. 1913. New York City, Riverside Drive. A house on Riverside Drive is not simply a house. It is a financial instrument with a facade. The street itself is a statement, broad, facing the river, close enough to the city's centers of finance and culture to be practical, far enough to feel insulated. The architecture is designed to tell a story before any word is spoken. Stone, carved details, high ceilings, windows that require scaffolding to clean. Schwab's mansion, later known as the Charles M. Schwab House, becomes one of the most expensive private homes in the United States at the time. The numbers attached to it are part of its purpose. Cost is not hidden. Cost is displayed as evidence of permanence. Inside, the mansion is administered like a small institution. Staff schedules, maintenance, inventory of linens, silver, glass, furnishings, artwork, receipts filed, deliveries received. Everything that looks effortless requires constant labor and constant spending. This is wealth translated into domestic architecture, an industrial man's attempt to hold a place in a social structure that was once dominated by inherited names. The mansion is also a signal to other centers of power. It says, "I am not merely a paid executive. I am a figure of the era." But domestic display, like steel, is subject to the weather of economics. The costs never stop. The building's maintenance does not care about market cycles. Staff must be paid. Repairs must be made. Heating must run. Insurance must be carried. A turning point is coming, and it is not social. It is structural. Even before the First World War, financial systems are tightening. The world is becoming more interconnected, and crises travel faster. Schwab's personal spending and financial arrangements begin to attract attention. Loans, guarantees, the habit of living at a scale that assumes continuous growth. In the war years, Bethlehem benefits from demand. The mills work, contracts flow, the national need for steel expands. But war also changes the state's relationship with industry. Oversight increases, political attention intensifies, profits become controversial. Questions of patriotism and pricing appear in headlines and hearings. Schwab navigates this environment as both industrial leader and public figure. The story of steel is no longer only about production, it is about legitimacy. What physically remains today is not his mansion. The Schwab house was later demolished, replaced by a modern apartment building. The site remains, but the physical proof of that particular expression of wealth is gone, which is its own kind of ending. The most expensive domestic monument of an era reduced to a plot for a different kind of New York living. The paper remains, photographs, architectural drawings, accounts in newspapers, a trail that can be followed through archives and the city's real estate history, showing how quickly the material symbols of power can disappear even when the power seemed absolute. The question is not whether a steel man can buy the look of permanence. The question is how long the look can survive the arithmetic. Chapter 7. The Requisition Order. April 1918. Washington, D.C., a government office where the air smells like paper and varnish. A corridor lined with doors, each door with a nameplate, each nameplate with an implied authority over something physical far away. Coal, rail cars, steel plate, ship timetables, labor allocations. Inside one office, a desk is crowded with forms that do not flatter anyone. Carbon copies, typed memos, routing slips, clipped to the top. A stack of requisitions waiting for a signature that will turn them into commands. A war does not run on speeches. It runs on standardized paperwork. Charles M. Schwab enters the wartime state the way he entered steel, through logistics. In 1918, he is brought into a federal role to accelerate shipbuilding, a task that looks heroic from a distance and clerical up close. Ships are not built by enthusiasm. They are built by steel schedules, yard capacity, riveting crews, engine delivery dates, and the ability to prevent bottlenecks that can freeze an entire program. The paperwork is relentless. Priority lists, allocation tables, requests that cannot all be satisfied at once, telegrams that compress entire arguments into a few lines. Every decision creates a loser, and the losers write back. A shipyard needs plate by a certain week, or the hull sits idle. A mill needs rail cars, or finished shapes stack up, unusable. A labor shortage in one yard forces overtime, which inflates costs, which triggers audits, which triggers politics. Schwab's advantage is not that he knows Washington. It is that he knows what happens when a timetable slips in the real world. He knows that steel is not available in a philosophical sense. Steel is available when a mill can roll it, when it can be inspected, when it can be loaded, when rail and water routes can move it, and when a yard can receive it without burying itself in congestion. The numbers are too large to fit comfortably into any one office. War orders mean volumes and deadlines that break normal industry assumptions. They also mean paperwork that multiplies. One contract becomes a dozen subcontracts. One ship becomes thousands of parts, each with its own supply chain, each with its own chance of failure. A turning point comes when the industrialist becomes, briefly, a public administrator. The logic shifts. In private industry, delay is punished by markets. In government, delay is punished by inquiry, hearings, reports, public suspicion. The war expands the state's reach into the industrial bloodstream, and men like Schwab are asked to keep it pumping faster. He pushes standardization because standardization is the only method that scales without collapsing. Standard hull types, standard parts where possible, a predictable flow of steel shapes and plate. The word standard becomes a weapon against chaos, but the war ends and a different kind of chaos arrives. When the armistice comes in November 1918, the paperwork does not stop. It changes direction. Cancellation notices, contract settlements, surplus inventories, facilities expanded for wartime output, now facing peacetime demand. Steel is an industry built on momentum. Blast furnaces cannot be treated like light switches without cost. Shipyards cannot be expanded and then politely shrunk without layoffs, debts, and empty capacity that still must be paid for. What remains today is the administrative record of how the modern American state learned to order industry at scale. Archives of wartime boards, shipbuilding programs, procurement routines, and the correspondence that shows how quickly industrial power becomes public responsibility when national need is on the line. The buildings in Washington remain still built for paper, still full of forms that decide what happens far away. The question is not whether a war can make industrialists look like patriots. The question is what the machinery of war does to the line between private power and public command. Chapter 8. The Loan Renewal. October 1929, New York City, a bank office where quiet is part of the product. The furniture is heavy, the carpet soft enough to swallow footsteps. A man sits at a desk with a blotter, a calendar, and a tray for documents arranged to look like calm. A loan renewal is a small act in this setting, a signature, a rate, a maturity date, a set of conditions attached to money that does not announce its own anxiety. But outside, the street noise changes, not in volume, in rhythm. People move with a different speed when something they believed was stable becomes uncertain. The 1920s have already taught steel a harsh lesson. Booms do not last long enough to pay for every expansion they encourage. The war's demand faded. A post-war spike appeared, then weakened. Steel is cyclical, and cycles punish the people who build as if growth is permanent. Bethlehem expanded under Schwab's leadership into a broad industrial organism. Plants, equipment, contracts, obligations. Expansion always carries its own shadow: debt service, maintenance, payroll commitments, the need to keep high utilization to make the arithmetic work. By the late 1920s, financial markets have become a national theater. Paper wealth grows quickly because paper is easy to multiply, but steel does not multiply without ore, coal, rail movement, labor, and time. There is always a lag between what the financial world imagines and what industrial reality can deliver. When markets crack, the first thing to happen is not smoke disappearing from stacks. The first thing is phone calls and ledgers. A banker asks for updated figures, inventory levels, receivables, contract backlogs, cash position. A clerk gathers the numbers. A secretary types them. A messenger carries them. The physical act of assembling the truth becomes urgent. Then the industrial consequences arrive. Demand weakens, orders slow, construction pauses, shipbuilding reduces, railroads defer upgrades. The nation does not stop needing steel, but it stops buying it at the rate required to keep all capacity profitable. Furnaces are banked, shifts reduced, payrolls cut. In steel towns, layoffs are not an abstraction. They are rent unpaid, groceries downgraded, families leaving. For Schwab personally, the decade brings a narrowing of options. High living was never merely taste, it was overhead. A mansion budget is fixed until it isn't, until staff is dismissed, until rooms are closed, until the building itself is sold or surrendered to time. Wealth that looked like permanence becomes a monthly reckoning. A turning point in the 1930s is the slow revelation that industrial legends do not retire as legends. They retire as people, aging, adjusting, watching their era turn into institutional memory. Schwab's public reputation remains immense, but reputation is not liquidity. It cannot pay bills. It cannot roll plate. It cannot keep furnaces lit when orders are absent. He continues to be treated as a symbol of the industry he helped shape, even as the industry's center of gravity shifts away from individual operators toward systems, boards, regulations, banks, government policies, and corporate structures built to survive men. He dies on September 18, 1939, in New York City, as Europe is already sliding into another war that will again make steel a national obsession. The timing is quiet, almost cruel in its symmetry. A man who made steel's scale visible does not live to see the next full mobilization that will confirm, again, how central the material is to modern power. What remains today is the broad, stubborn footprint of the steel age and the depression that tested it. Preserved industrial structures, corporate archives, bank records, city property histories, and the altered landscapes of mill towns that still carry the geometry of rail spurs and yard layouts. In Bethlehem, the furnaces stand as public monument and commercial backdrop, a skeletal proof that this was once an engine room for national strength. The question is not whether markets can fall. The question is what a life built on expansion does when the arithmetic turns against it. Closing, the filing stamp returned to February 1901, New Jersey, the corporate law office where the air is controlled and the paper is thick. If you could walk into the room again decades later, the furniture would not be the same. The men would not be the same. The telegraph office would be replaced by other technologies. The mill towns would have changed their skin. But the logic would be familiar. A corporation is born when someone decides that a signature is more permanent than a furnace flame. The papers that created a steel empire are not dramatic, but they endure. They sit in files, in bound volumes, in archives, in the sediment of legal and financial institutions designed to remember. A filing stamp does not rust. A docket number does not collapse. A corporate charter can outlive every building it once owned. And yet, the physical world keeps score in a different way. Bridges and skyscrapers, riveted ships and structural frames, rail networks reinforced with standardized shapes. These are the places steel hides in plain sight. You can stand under a beam and see nothing but paint. You can cross a bridge and forget the tonnage beneath your tires. Steel's greatest triumph is that it becomes background. So the inheritance was never a single man's fortune, even when the headlines tried to make it one. The inheritance was a method. Take raw material and labor, translate them into output, translate output into securities, translate securities into authority, and then defend authority with paperwork so thick it feels like inevitability. Schwab's life shows how a nation reshaped itself around that method. He rose through time clocks and tonnage. He learned to speak in a dining room without forgetting the mill floor. He helped birth a corporation so large it changed the country's vocabulary of scale. He left it when its governance demanded a different kind of man. He built again, faster, closer to his instincts, tying steel to war and national need. He displayed permanence in stone on Riverside Drive, only for permanence to be revised by later economics and later builders. In the end, what survives is not the mansion, not the dinner, not even the specific personalities in the boardroom. What survives is the document trail, the industrial geography, and the quiet truth that modern power prefers forms that can be filed. The question is not whether America inherited its steel from men like Schwab. The question is whether men like Schwab ever truly controlled what steel would make of America.